Alright, hello UAT, hello the world. This is Eric Marshall, and I'm going to be covering a more in-depth review on the design documentation for Scales of Fate, my student innovation project for University of Advancing Technology. So, to begin with, Scales of Fate is going to be a game mechanic wherein which you take the role of fate on the aspect that you deal with the probability of an event occurring. So instead of directly controlling a player pawn, you're actually controlling the likelihood of an occurrence inside of an event with an AI. And the AI is predominantly just going to be there to demonstrate the consequences of the choices that the player makes as the hands of fate. So the build intention, it's going to be built within Unreal Engine 5, and a large of that was due to the increased technical specifications and the community's growing awareness of Unreal Engine 5 and the additional options and functions that the new Unreal Engine brings. But, as I've said previously, the mechanic will be changing the likelihood of an event occurring from an object as player choice, and the game will have an AI that interacts with the environment. It is worth it to note, even at this point, that this game mechanic has a lot of potential as an adversary system for spicing up the online player versus player environment. Mechanics of the game. After the percentages of an event occurring on an object to allow a player to affect how frequently or less frequently an event occurs. Have a user interface that is very approachable and have variety for events occurring within the game world. So not just the same thing in multiple different locations, a meaningful number of multiple different interactions for the player to deal with. And this is just a very rough prototype of how the events would interact or how the AI would interact with them. So let's say there's the probability of a set of lights flickering in the scene, and the result that it gets from the AI would be to make the AI look at it. Now, this could actually increase the likelihood of another event occurring, which would be there's like a folding rug. So if the AI is looking at the light, there's a higher likelihood that they're going to trip on the folding rug than if they weren't looking at the light and they'd just catch themselves if they started tripping. So the trip event could actually occur with or without the look at lights event. And the look at lights event could still occur even if there was no possibility for the trip on rug event. But there's going to be certain Venn diagram interactions between the two of them where in which one occurring will cause a higher likelihood of the other succeeding. So just the fact that the trip occurs doesn't mean the AI will fall prone. There's the innate possibility for the AI to resist the hand of fate, and that is a very integral mechanic for the game mechanic itself, the sub mechanic of the game mechanic, in order to get it working. Because it can't be an absolute result, it just has to be a likelihood that it will occur, but not a certainty. In order for the mechanic to be properly realized, there needs to be uncertainty of result. It has to have a sense of suspense in order to be a proper game mechanic for Fate. You can set things up and try to get them to occur, but if they always occur, then there's no sense of suspense, there's no sense of anticipation, there's no sense of thrill. So that is what I'm more aiming towards for this game mechanic. I could do like Rube Goldberg-esque things, but I felt that the mechanic would be better delivered through the suspense of a possible outcome rather than the certainty of a possible outcome when something triggers. So, like when Trip on Rug triggers. Okay, maybe they trip, maybe they don't trip. And a lot of this is coming from the time I spent playing Dungeons and Dragons. And as both a DM and as a player, you have the percentiles, and I can go into the metaphysics and the probability matrices, which I'm going to definitely be referring to and considering as I make this game mechanic. But there's a certain percentage of how easy it is to get any type of a roll, and there's a level of suspense when that dice is finally rolled, and the excitement and the thrill of that uncertainty that I want to recreate through the game mechanics. So you'd be almost sitting in the role of like the dungeon master or the game master, and you'd be setting up these situations, and then you get to see if they succeed or fail, and you get to see the way that the AI interacts with them. So there's this sense that you're setting up the staging, then you get to see the interaction. But I want there to be uncertainty to it so that it's always interesting to interact with it rather than, oh, I did such and such and such and such, and I did X, Y, so therefore the end result is always going to be Z. I don't want that. That is much too finite of a game mechanic, and I don't think it is as entertaining. So, like, over here, there's other results that could happen. So, if somebody actually falls flat on the rug, they could have a picture frame fall on top of them or something else. The picture frame could never move, the picture frame could never slide. And these are all independent events that can interact with each other, but don't always have to. And they interact, but they also simultaneously exist separately from one another, which I think is one of the most important concepts of this mechanic. They all have an inner working, but they're also all independent. This one doesn't set off this one, doesn't set off this one. This one occurs, and this one can occur, and this one can occur. And the occurrence of each does not prevent the occurrence of the others. So the triggers aren't chained together. You don't have to have this one occur before this one can occur before this one can occur. This one can occur even if these two don't, which is the importance of the interactions between them. So the formula, I was advised by my subject matter expert that I should probably develop a currency system for it. So after a good bit of deliberation, some Excel spreadsheets, and some mathematical number crunching, I came up with this formula here. So we have on the top here L for which is standing in for likelihood of an event occurring, and then we have 10 minus S. And 10 minus S is meant to be an inverse indication. This is a sliding scale from 1 to 9. 0 and 10 not being realistic values for the considerations of this equation. S can only be a number between 0 and 1, but it cannot be, or can only be a number between 0 and 10, but it cannot be 0 or 10. So it can only be between 0 and 10. And the main point of this is that this gives me a very nice curve of probabilities, because when L up here, so L can be any number between 0 and 100. And what that'll do is this gives me a C value for any probability that's currently on an object. So if I want to alter the severity of a rug tripping the AI, let's say the severity of the event is a 4. So on the bottom, that would give me a 6. And the larger the number is on the bottom, the smaller the overall number is going to become. So, and let's say I make it almost a certainty. So let's say it is like a 90% certainty. So 90% gets divided by 6, and that ends up being my currency float value. And then the currency float value could be used to balance the currency in the system in order to determine how many points that the player is spending for the sake of limiting them to under a certain number of points for an event occurring. Or if we're going with like the zero sum model, If I reduce the number of fate points that are in one object to make it less likely to occur, I have to go somewhere else and put those points in something else, which would make it more likely to occur. So in this instance, the currency keeps the game from getting too completely out of balance, and it institutes a gameplay balance to the game itself. So they can't just go through the entire room and say none of this is going to occur ever, because then the system would become completely loaded with points. The other thing would be is that if I was balancing it with an AI system, I could have it so that the delta, the change in the original value of what the likelihood and severity of something was, if we could theoretically in a larger build make the severity of a interaction change what type of interaction that object has, or even have multiple different types of events on a single object. But for the sake of the demo, we're just going to be changing the likelihood of an event occurring rather than the severity of whatever that event is going to be. We're just going to be changing the likelihood of the event and then dealing with the fallout for that through the game currency. Coincidence coins. I'll just okay. Instinctive, visceral gut reaction. They're just going to be coincidence coins. So the currency of my Scales of Fate game is coincidence coins. So part of this game is the interface has to be really intuitive, really easy to interact with, and really simple. Because the game is only supposed to last as a demo for between 5 to 10 minutes. So that means that within seconds of picking up the game, a player needs to be able to click around a couple times and figure out how to play the game, even without a tutorial. So the interface needs to be intuitive. I click on something, it pops up a menu. That's intuitive. I hover my mouse over something that I can interact with. It highlights. I click on it, it pops open. I can just use my mouse to alter the menu. The menu has a very intuitive style of interaction. There's going to be pips for plus or minus, and there's going to be very strong symbology for it. So I was thinking like using merchant scales. So when you open up an object, the likelihood of an event occurring would be demonstrated by a merchant scale. So a neutral level of like 50-50 would be a coin toss, and that could be represented by balance scales. And then the more likely you are to have the event occur, the more coins would be on one side of the scale that doesn't have the balancing weight on it. So having a very visual, plain graphic reference for the likelihood of an event occurring or not occurring needs to be very clearly demonstrated. And like I said, severity up here, S. Severity could very easily be represented by the size of the weight on the other side, or what type of weight is on the other side. So if it was like an event that could kill somebody, I could put a skull on one side, and then the coins for how likely or unlikely it is to occur would be on the other. And then the coins on the other side could actually stack up by the denominations to reflect how much coincidence coins it takes in order to increase the likelihood of that event. And I think representing it in that way also plays into the design and the theme of the game as well. And but the main thing from a design point for the user interface would be that having that symbology there weaves it all together. And since the symbology would be fairly universal, it would further build into the ease of use, because when people see it, they'd be able to identify what they're doing when they're interacting with it. And that would make gameplay easier for them, because if they see something on one side, okay, that's how much of an impact this has, and then on the other they see their coincidence coins, and it's like, okay, so this is how much of the game currency it cost me in order to buy this influence. Okay, so then they just balance those two. And like I said, at a later demo, you might be able to swap out what's on the other side of the scale to change what the object does, but that is well beyond the scope of this build. So the fine points on player interaction, like I talked about a little bit before. An interactable object, when it's hovered over, it needs to highlight so that the player knows that they're hovered over an interactable object. When it's selected, the highlight color needs to be a different color to indicate that that's the object they're interacting with. The interaction menu for it, like I was saying when I was spitballing the idea of the visual aspects of the user interface, it needs to be symbolic, and it needs to be easy to understand, and it needs to show up in between the player and the user. This seems like a non grata kind of thing, but if you're interacting with objects and your menu is not appearing in between you and the object, that means it could be appearing behind the object, which means since the object's going to intercept that raycast, you're not going to be able to interact with the menu for the object if the menu shows up behind it. So this is one of the finer points of the user interface. The menu needs to appear in an area where in which the player can actually interact with it, and it needs to appear in such a way that a portion of it does not appear off screen, because I run into that at times when I'm playing other games, and it frustrates me to no end. I'm going to try to avoid building one of my own pet peeves. The entire interaction process, because this is such a simple demo, needs to be able to be done with nothing but the mouse. You can wazad around the map, like I say here, but the actual interaction with the object needs to require nothing more than a mouse. We're not going to get into any deep keystroke combinations, button press combinations, timing events, QuickTime events, none of that. The thing needs to be able to be completely resolved with nothing but the mouse and the mouse's buttons. In order for this to be a really solid presentation of the game mechanic as the game mechanic demo, you need to be able to use nothing more than WASD and the mouse. This is just demonstrating a mechanic, not a full game, full depth play, consequences, carryover, role-playing elements. This is just a game mechanic demo. This needs to be so simple, so directly interactive, and so ready to pick up players and get them into the game instantaneously that it cannot have any convoluted, complex, or nuisance system. It needs to be click here, stupid, simple. So the sense of the gameplay, the sense of how the mechanic actually builds gameplay or creates gameplay, needs to be demonstrated by some sort of bounce mechanic. So it's like, okay, this is what you have. These are the limits on what you have. Work within those limits. The sense of giving players this really powerful ability, in this instance, literally controlling the hands of fate, requires that there be some opposing force or some limit on that in order to make them be creative within a sandbox. Giving the sandbox a confined bounds, but then giving them these abilities to use, allows them to explore the most that they can get out of something within a constraint, which tends to produce more engagement than just giving them a power and telling them to go at it. Because when you just have this massive vacuum of space to do anything you want with, you can get bored really easily because there's no specific goal, and it becomes much harder to set a goal when you just are completely all powerful. The purpose of having the obstacles to overcome or having the limits to get around will cause players to think more deeply about their what they're doing with the game mechanic. And in doing that, I have come up with 3 possible implementations of the game mechanic that provide those limits that will make the players have to engage more deeply in thought about how they're going to use the game mechanic and the power and abilities that they're given in order to interact with the game world and accomplish their own agency in the game. So, one of the ones that I initially came up with was that I would have a game engine that would balance the coincidence coins by spending its own coincidence coins on other things after the players made their selections. The other one would just limit the number of coincidence coins that the player could spend. So they would have a neutral pool of it, which is kind of a mixed value thing. A lot of other games do it with other stuff, like the traditional RPG game is that you start with all these stats and it costs you so much to put these many points into buying upgrades for them. So when a player's instead of rolling a character, players are given X amount of points that they can put into such and such abilities, and by how they distribute those points, it's how much it costs. And buying a really strong value in one costs more than just slightly upgrading another. And the balancing for the role playing mechanics for like a character sheet is something that was definitely taken in consideration for this. Because I obviously use a weighted scaling system for the coincidence coins. I don't necessarily like this sub mechanic for the system, if solely because it's been used a lot, and I want to be a little bit more innovative. So having a zero sum system instead, where the player is forced to balance themselves instead of having the engine do it for them, seems to still feed into the whole. It doesn't ruin the immersion because it still feeds into the whole Hands of Fate concept, because they're having to counterbalance their own changes. So instead of having the having an AI that auto balances it from within the engine of the game demo itself, having the players have to balance themselves still seems like it's the Hand of Fate. It The second one seems kind of immersion ruining to me. I feel that I should be able to, if I can't manage to accomplish this top one, I should still be able to accomplish this bottom one. This one is a really simple. The second one here, with limiting how much in the way of coincidence coins they can spend, seems a bit cheap to me. It's very easily, it's very easy to do, but that's probably why it feels so cheap to me. This last one here seems to stick more with the theme, and the top one, well, that one could definitely cause some randomness depending on how random the system actually is. A lot of that would I'd actually have to pull out the data structures and algorithms for this top one here and make a sort algorithm so that the game would know the best way to redistribute the coincidence coin balance. These two, the bottom one is probably the most chaotic and gives the players the absolute most influence over an area, and the ability to switch it up and make variety out of that will be pretty epic. You could even have a head-to-head system with this bottom one here, or with the top one, really, because it's the same mechanic, it's just executed in a different way for the sub-mechanic of the fate scale. Because at the end of the day, this is supposed to be a game mechanic, so how I implement the influences of the player choice and how I limit the player choice in a constructive manner is going to be largely influenced by which of these mechanics I choose to support the currency system. But other than that, I don't anticipate this taking more than 4 months. It shouldn't take terribly long after 4 months. I think I should have most of the development done within 2.5 months, and the rest of it will just be fine tuning the development and presentation so that it looks like so that it looks like it is. I'm a programmer. It's a soft machine, so that it looks like it and is a very finely polished game demo, really. Even if it's just for the one game mechanic and demonstrating how the game mechanic works, I want it to occur in a meaningful environment, which means dealing with developing a proper scene for it, I want the AI to behave in, if not necessarily a realistic fashion, because it could be cartoonish. I want the AI's gestures and movements within it to be meaningful in relation to the player choices and the events that occur in the scene. And I want there to be a sense of presence that the player has even after they've set things in motion and taken their hands off of it. I really and honestly do want this game mechanic to have a lasting impression on the people who play the demo. So, I think the lion's share of the development's only going to take 2.5 months, but the polishing is going to take that extra month, month and a half, in order to really get the presentation spot on. So, thank you for your time.